Welcome in, guys. This is Basch here, bringing you this presentation of the Basch CFB Top 25. So let's get right on it. And the number 25 team is going to be Northwestern. Listen, there was going to be a little bit of controversy here. Northwestern started out very weak, but part of me is going to be a little bit biased. Not necessarily biased, but part of me is going to be a little bit in favor of how you are playing now versus how you were playing early in the season. So, Northwestern, how they've been playing lately, they had a chance to beat Notre Dame at home. It's not a bad loss. Didn't hurt them at all in my eyes when I had them on kind of the outside looking in, beyond the outside looking in. But a big win against a Iowa team that I value highly. They're kind of in the same spot that Northwestern was in, kind of on that outside looking in. And this is big for Notre Dame, too, because it's another top 25 win in which they could be desperate for if they end up losing to either Syracuse or USC late, and they are going to get in a debate on one of those last two spots maybe in the college football playoff rankings. So number 25 is going to be Northwestern. Losses to Akron early is really the only bad loss. I wouldn't consider Duke to be a bad loss. Duke's a 7-3 football team, in which we'll get to Duke in a bit. If they were to play again today, I would definitely take Northwestern. And they also have a loss against Michigan, which, of course, isn't a bad loss. Number 24, Kentucky. Kentucky had a terrible, horrendous loss against a Tennessee team, but Tennessee is improving. I just don't like the fashion of how they lost against a team that may not even make a bowl game this year, despite how much they are improving. With that being said, this is a top 25 team. I don't know how you can really argue that. I just don't want to put them much higher because I really, even the whole thing with Tennessee, considered that Tennessee is playing better. You start to look at some of these games now. They got beat bad against Georgia, and they couldn't score against Missouri. This team being so one-dimensional on offense, very concerning, and definitely a team that has losses. Boise State, the reason I rank Boise State instead of maybe an Army is because Boise State's number one. Boise State plays a stronger schedule than Army, specifically out of the wins. But number two, Boise State just beat a team that I value pretty highly in Fresno State, which we'll get to, or no, not a spoiler, but they've been playing some good football, and this division is going to come down to a possible top 25 matchup. Definitely for me, could be a top 25 matchup if both teams win this weekend. But definitely could be a top 25 matchup between Boise State and Utah State, even in the college football playoff poll. Number 22, the Cincinnati Bearcats. They make it back into the rankings after another win. This time, it was against the USF, and Cincinnati, since that Temple loss, has progressively gotten better. They win in overtime against SMU, which is leading the West Division right now, and then they progressively get better. They beat a better USF team, but they got UCF coming up this week, and primetime college game day is going, and Cincinnati better be ready. Number 21, the Michigan State Spartans. They don't drop that much because, of course, of the team that they played, Ohio State, and also that his quarterback situation was very iffy with Lombardi and Lewerke. And finally, Felton Davis was out for that game, taking out a huge component, as Michigan State's been known for their balance on offense this season. And when having Felton Davis and Cody White on the outside that they can use to their advantage, and that can be opened up by the run game, in which they did not really get going against Ohio State after Hayward having a big game. But nonetheless, Michigan State's still a solid team. They don't have a bad loss. Even Arizona State, not a bad loss. Michigan State lost to Arizona State by a field goal at a 10:30 kick, and Arizona State, by the way, is leading their division in the Pac-12 South. And then they have losses to Michigan, Northwestern, and Ohio State, all three teams that are ranked. However, I would see the argument that Northwestern is ranked ahead of Sparty. The only reason I don't have Northwestern ranked above Sparty is that Akron loss. That Akron loss is why Northwestern and Sparty aren't flipped, because the line between 25 and 21 to me is pretty close. Number 20, Boston College, and I think Boston College is a little bit different. And the rest of these teams are 7-3, but they which by the way they did lose to Purdue pretty bad in blowout fashion. Their other two losses aren't as bad. NC State and Clemson, despite NC State dropping out of the rankings. Just a little spoiler, but nonetheless, boys. Boston College is still playing some good football. They dropped a handful of spots for me. I think it's enough, but we'll definitely see how the College Football Playoff Committee ranks them. I think the problem with them this past week, and maybe this will be under consideration, Anthony Brown got hurt. I just don't think they had a game plan for E.J. Perry. Not that they couldn't have competed better with Clemson if they had Anthony Brown in the game, but E.J. Perry, with a better game plan, could have played better against Clemson, and I kind of lost my train of thought there. Let's move on. Number 19, Washington. They're quietly getting better. They beat Stanford a couple weeks back. That's a big win. So now it's setting up for the Apple Cup, which will probably end up being Washington versus Washington State for the conference. And for Washington State, possibly all the marbles, as they are the one-loss team, kind of flipped from what we thought in the preseason could be the case. Washington, though, is slowly kind of, or really quietly kind of getting better, and it will be very fun to watch Washington through specifically the Apple Cup. If they can win that game, see if they can win the conference and go to the Rose Bowl, they could definitely gain a little bit of traction here. Washington's looking a lot better than they did kind of early on offense, and when they dropped those 3 games, Auburn, Oregon, and I can't remember what their third loss was. Number 18, Iowa State. Iowa State is another one of those teams who don't really have a bad loss. Their losses coming against Iowa, Oklahoma, and who's the third loss? It was a Big 12 game for sure. Think of what it was. It might have been, no, I was about to say, it might have been Oklahoma State. I don't know, I can't remember. Either way, they do have 2 losses in conference, 3 losses. It might be Oklahoma State. Let me check this. I'm going to be mad about it if I don't get this. Iowa State lost to TCU. That's right. I guess that's a pretty bad loss. TCU by 3 is a bad loss on the road. That's all I gotta say. I don't know. So, but none. That's that TCU loss, and they got Texas to test themselves this week, and they beat West Virginia since that TCU loss as well. So Iowa State definitely something to hang their hat on is that West Virginia win. Hopefully they can hang their hat on. They're hoping they can hang their hat on. Not that I'm rooting either way, on a big win against Texas. Number 17, the Florida Gators. Chomp, chomp. I'm still not high on Florida. I think they should have lost against South Carolina, and they got beat down by Missouri the week prior, which was just an ugly loss. But outside of that, they don't have an ugly loss. Kentucky, which has the same record, but I value Florida a little bit heavier. That game, like I said, that's going to start to happen as we get later into the season. There's a little bit more clarity on, which games were flukes and which games were the better team won. I don't think the better team won between Florida and Kentucky. I think the better team won between Georgia and Florida. And Florida, even though they aren't worse than Missouri, technically, that's still a really bad loss that you got to factor in. But you're going to see that a lot more where I'm going to start valuing teams higher. If I feel like it was a fluke win. I feel like Kentucky against Florida was a fluke win that Florida wasn't really prepared for early in the season. And if they played now, I would take Florida in a heartbeat to beat Kentucky. But I don't think Florida would beat much else. I mean, if Tennessee and Florida rematch, it would be a heck of a lot different game. This Florida team is just not as good as advertised, and neither is Kentucky. Number 16, Penn State. And this is another team that they wish they could get healthy so that way they could, and they wish they could have that Michigan game back because they feel like they could have won that game. But a loss is a loss. But Penn State, their losses kind of like the other ones, even though one of them was a blowout. Not against bad teams. In fact, all three ranked between Ohio State, Michigan State, and Michigan. Plus, they have a win against Iowa that I value. Wisconsin, that it's getting harder to value, but you still kind of can value a win against Wisconsin. Now 6-4 team. So that's what I think about Penn State. I don't think they're a bad team. I just think they've really been hurt by the injury problems that they've had with Trace McSorley in specific. That and those holes in the defense that and you could possibly go back. I don't know if I still have them. Possibly go back to some of my preseason videos where I said there's a lot of holes in this Penn State defense, specifically down the middle of the field where they lost 2 defensive tackles. They lost their key middle linebacker in Jason Kabinda, and then they lost a starting safety, 2 starting safeties I think it was, and then a cornerback. So they definitely were hurting already coming into the season on defense, but offensively it's really just Trace McSorley has been hurt. And it's kind of deflated a lot of their stats, in which this could possibly be a top 10, 15 offense. When McSorley's healthy, they are definitely top 15. Number 15. Hey, talk about top 15. We are in the top 15 NC Utah Utes. I didn't get down on Utah after they did lose to Arizona State because I don't think Arizona State's bad. But I think that's a key loss for the Utes, as they are 7-3 now, but all 3 losses in Pac-12 play. And if you look at the Pac-12 right now, the South has a little bit of clarity. Utah wins out. They could, and are lost by Arizona State. They could easily be looking at a conference championship. Now, of course, Utah finishes the season against BYU. They got Colorado this week, but in which they are favored by 7 points, but they got BYU also on championship weekend. Arizona State still has Oregon. Arizona's been playing better football, starting to use Khalil Tate to his ability, and Oregon's also still a solid team, not a great team, but a solid team. So Arizona State's got a couple tests left. If they lose one game, that means Utah's going to trounce on to the Pac-12 championship, assuming Utah goes on to beat Colorado, because the only other team with 3 losses in conference is Arizona, and Arizona needs Colorado to beat Utah. It doesn't matter what happens between BYU and Utah when it comes to conference play. So if Arizona wants to get in, they need to win both their games. That includes a win against Arizona State, and Utah needs to lose against Colorado in an upset. That isn't impossible, but still is very far-fetched in my opinion. Nonetheless, though, 7-3 Utah, number 15 in the country, which helps Washington State. Number 14, the Texas Longhorns. And Texas, with a big win against Oklahoma, kind of carrying the cake for them. They lost only by 1 point against West Virginia. I think what really hurts Texas here in not being a little bit higher and higher than a 2-loss team or a couple 2-loss teams in the Power 5 is their loss against Maryland week 1. And I get it's week 1, and I get it was only 5 points, and I get Maryland's a 500 football team as we speak today. But you got to consider that Texas sorry, I lost my train of thought. Okay, so that Texas kind of picked up right after that, and maybe it wasn't as much of a fluke as we want to call it, but, it was a bad loss week 1, but it's not that bad because it was only by 5 points on the road against a 500 football team. It's not terrible, but it's not. Their resume is just not strong enough for me to jump them. They really only have the Oklahoma win as a ranked win. Other than that, they have Iowa State this weekend that could possibly be big, but that would be the only other ranked win that they would have on their schedule now that they've lost to West Virginia. And of course, Texas also lost to, and they struggled last week against Texas Tech too. That one went to the wire, and it was a pretty fun game to watch. But they did struggle They also lost to Oklahoma State, which is another 500 football team. So when you lose, and I don't know how Oklahoma State and Maryland is going to finish out. We'll see how they do. They could both be 500. They could also, one of them, be 7-5, 5-7 range. But losing to two 500 football teams is not good. Two unranked football teams. Texas, if they were 9-1 right now, would easily be in the top 6, but they are not. They lost to West Virginia by 1 point, and they lost to Maryland and Oklahoma State. Those two losses really hurt Texas. Number 13, Syracuse, and that would be one of the teams that you would possibly consider Texas being ahead. Of course, Syracuse losing by narrow margins against Clemson, which is a good loss. It's a valuable loss. I don't like the Pitt loss, mainly because of what Pitt did against Penn State. Even though the score didn't indicate how close that game was, it still wasn't a close game. It was 51-6, for goodness sakes. When you ever get a 51-6 game, it's not going to be close. Whether or not it's closer than the score indicates, it's still not going to be close. A 45-point deficit is just too much. But they did lose to a team in Pitt like that. That's the only common opponent, by the way, they have with Penn State, which could possibly be comparable. But that series getting wins against teams like the Boston College of the world, or the Boston Colleges of the world, when they have wins against NC State, which is still somewhat of value. Those two wins, really, it's hard. And the loss to Clemson not being a bad loss, it's hard to devalue a Syracuse team who's all the way up here. Number 12, the Utah State Aggies, and a lot of people are, wait, who do you have ahead of Syracuse if at 13? That makes no sense. UCF, well, there's another team there. Utah State's that other team. And Utah State, quite honestly, if UCF loses to Cincinnati, Utah State would have a better resume. Their loss would be by 7 points against Michigan State, which on the road versus at home, it's a better loss, to be honest with you, even though Cincinnati would be ranked higher than Michigan State. And a lot of people are going to be like, well, Michigan State beat Utah State. So what? Utah State's 9-1. I would argue, actually, that Utah State probably should have won that game, and frankly, they should have, because they led quite a bit of that game, and they definitely stuck around with Michigan State and had a chance to win that ball game late. They were up by 1 point in the fourth quarter, very late, when Michigan State had a game-winning drive. And they really don't have a bad game outside of that. They struggled a little bit against Wyoming, but Wyoming has this very good defense that gave Washington State a lot of problems in the first half before Washington State finally pulled away, and that one was on the road in Laramie. Outside of that, they've really dominated everyone. Hawaii, they dominated. New Mexico, they dominated. They really haven't had a close game, and they got Boise State coming up. That could be possibly a game for, and not for Boise State, because I don't see a scenario. Right now, they're my fourth highest ranked group of 5. I don't see a scenario where Boise State ends up getting to New Year's 6. But all of a sudden, if they beat Boise State, maybe UCF loses to Cincinnati or Houston, if Houston can get into that conference championship game. I highly doubt anyone else is going to beat UCF. I would take only Houston to beat UCF, or take the chance of UCF losing to Houston over anyone else. That's really the only chance I give them. But if UCF loses and Utah State beats Boise State, they could possibly end up in the New Year's Six Bowl. And you know, I was high on Utah State early in the season. I didn't think they could fly this high to the point where they'd be undefeated in conference, and their only loss was to Michigan State by a mere 7 points. Moving on, the number 11 team is going to be LSU, sitting at 8-2 as well. They had a shutout loss by 30 against Alabama. And look, even though Mississippi State lost 24-0 and got shut out, at least they should have scored. LSU shouldn't have scored against Alabama. There was no reason for LSU to really be on the field on offense. They should have just punted the ball away after running about a minute and a half off the clock. That's how that game should have transpired. But Mississippi State, at least they got screwed over by a fumble that was not called a fumble for some odd reason that I don't like how that was handled and not reviewed, in a block in the back that was completely egregious. And we'll get more to that game when we talk about Alabama. But really, LSU just showed in that game that they can't really compete with the big dogs, and it really ticks me off that LSU is ranked even in the top 10 for a lot of people ahead of UCF. It really gets on my nerves because I don't even think UCF would lose by 30 against Alabama. I don't think anyone that I have in my top 10 would lose by 30 against Alabama. They may lose by 20, they may lose by 28. They wouldn't lose by 30, and they certainly, no one would get shut out against Alabama in the top 10. It's just ridiculous that LSU is number 7 for the College Football Playoff Committee. I don't know why they have all these SEC teams ranked higher, because honestly, the SEC is tough. It's tough. It's a gauntlet. But it might not even be the best conference right now. I'm kind of referring back to the SEC, basically in a tie, locked up with the Big Ten right now for the best conference, and I can talk about that a little more. But LSU, they may have good wins, but look, in my top 25, I don't have Mississippi State ranked, even though that would be a valuable win. They technically don't have a top 25 win there. So when you talk about Georgia, Mississippi State with wins, and you cannot whatsoever bring up 500 Miami. I heard that point earlier. You beat Miami, Georgia, and Mississippi State. Miami should not count. I have it as LSU only beat one top 25 team and really had 2 quality victories, Mississippi State. Miami is not a quality victory on a neutral site against a 500 football team is not whatsoever a quality win. So quit calling it that. That's the same crap we had to deal with last year with Alabama, Florida State. And now Florida State had to reschedule UL Monroe just to make a bowl game, but somehow it was an impressive win for Alabama. We need to look at the current rankings and say, look, this team is not what we thought it was in the preseason. Don't consider that a quality win. Number 10, the Oklahoma Sooners. Wow, harsh. I moved them down actually about 3 spots. Why? Because they have no defense. And I'm tired of seeing no defense being represented in the, at least, in West Virginia is going to be ranked quite a bit higher because West Virginia is actually playing defense. They might not have an elite defense, but it's good enough. Oklahoma, did you know Oklahoma is 79th out of 130 teams, and that's all FBS teams. 79th in scoring defense. That is awful. If you want to be an elite team, you cannot allow 46, 47, and 48 points. More than 45 points 3 times. I kind of want to actually look at the statistic out of the teams I have ranked currently. How many times has teams given up 45 points or more? I honestly, if I had to guess, out of the combined 1 through 9 for my rankings, I would guess maybe twice. That's not an elite team. So if Oklahoma can shore up that defense, slow down Will Grier, which I highly doubt they can, and not allow West Virginia to score more than 50, then maybe I'll consider Oklahoma to be in the playoff. But honestly, with that bad of a defense, I do not want to see them in the playoff this year because they don't have a Baker Mayfield to get them out of a hole, and they don't have some of the playmakers that they are missing, such as Okoronkwo on that defensive side. That defense is worse than it was last year. That defense last year wasn't good, but at least they were good enough. They're not nearly as good, and for goodness sakes, they need to bench Pernell Motley. That dude is awful in coverage. Number 9, the Ohio State Buckeyes, and it's still close between Ohio State and Oklahoma, but like I said with Oklahoma, they have pretty comparable resumes. Ohio State has a worse loss but better wins than Oklahoma. But when you get comparable resumes, what I see on the field is a Buckeye team who hasn't been elite on defense all year, but looked elite on Saturday, and they have a much better defense. And Oklahoma is 79th, as I said, on scoring defense. Ohio State is 26th. So even though Ohio State's not great on defense, they are good enough. They are good, and they certainly have good offense as well. They are 8th in passing, and also the last 2 weeks they've had a 100-yard back. One of those weeks, keep in mind, was against the number 1 rush defense, in which Ohio State, it's not much, but Ohio State ran for over 40 yards over Michigan State's average allowed per game. And they definitely ran more than Michigan did. And Michigan's more of a prolific rushing attack with Karan Higdon. So Ohio State's starting to turn up the run game, and if they can go ahead and put everything together, Ohio State is a playoff team. That's the difference between Oklahoma and Ohio State. I don't see how Oklahoma can fix that defense. I could see how Ohio State could fix their defense. It's simple gap control schemes changed up, which they have in the front seven, so the linebackers are playing better football. And on the outside, it just takes a little bit more discipline. Ohio State's locking up in coverage. It's all about turning your head and being able to make a play on the ball. And that's something that these players can do, and they're good in coverage. Versus when you look at Oklahoma, it's not gap assignments that Oklahoma's struggling with on the linebacking core. It's Oklahoma's linebackers getting out of place, and it's Oklahoma's skill really getting to the ball on the linebacking core. It's not schematics that you can fix. And on the corners, it's not that Oklahoma is sticking with the receivers, but they're not making plays on the ball. Oklahoma has corners that are getting burnt, absolutely burnt by receivers, and we've seen it the last 2 weeks. Big play after big play for Texas Tech and Oklahoma State the last couple weeks. And if Ohio State went up against Oklahoma State and Texas Tech, they could probably score 30, 35 points, but they would not be able to on a consistent basis. They could get, like TCU did with the big run with Darius Anderson. There could be a couple blown assignments in the game that could lead to big plays, but it wouldn't be on a consistent basis where they're allowing 10, 15 yards. While Ohio State's getting these 15 yards or more plays, and they are able to decrease the amount of 15-yard plays. And they have over time, too, throughout the year. But when you talk about how much they give up, Ohio, it's not nearly as much as Oklahoma's giving up. And it's just a joke to honestly consider Oklahoma as a playoff team right now with that defense. Number 8, Washington State. I'm done venting there. Utah is their key win, and I really like Utah, and that makes me really like Washington State. Also, they've been looking great, and their loss was kind of a fluky loss against a 500 football team in USC. That could definitely change that with a couple of big wins with UCLA and Notre Dame left on the schedule. But that game was kind of fluky. We all know what happened there with the referees giving that targeting call and a blocked field goal for Washington State. Like they're that close to being undefeated right now. Of course, they are not. But they've rolled past a lot of these opponents. I didn't expect them to go in to Boulder this week and throttle Colorado. I expected a very good game out of that. But they did just that. They throttled Colorado. I think it was 31-7. Not only does their offense with Gardner Minshew, and Gardner Minshew definitely should get Heisman love, not only is that offense looking elite, but that defense is looking good. Very interesting there. I'm sorry about that. Life of a team. Number 7, West Virginia. And I'll get to West Virginia when I get back. That's as much as you can see right there. But number 7, just give me a second. I'll be right back. All right, sorry about that. We're going to pick up here. Oh, no. Spoiler, because we all know. Well, hold on. There's one team you haven't seen yet. Anyway, number 7 is going to be West Virginia and the Mountaineers. Howdy to the Mountaineers. West Virginia has a defense. West Virginia, of course, held Texas when they needed to go ahead and come back in that game. West Virginia held Texas Tech and made big plays on defense when they needed to finish off that game. West Virginia has a defense, guys, and that's the difference between Oklahoma and West Virginia right now. Both of them have electric offenses, but West Virginia's defense is far better. And I highly doubt Oklahoma is going to beat West Virginia in Morgantown just because of that. And now, if that happens, I think Iowa State's going to win, so I think it will be a rematch of Oklahoma and West Virginia, which, you know, rematches have interesting ways of working out, but I think West Virginia is just a better team, and I honestly don't think that they're really all that close to Washington State and Ohio State right now. I think if there was any team that controlled their own destiny from 7 through 10 into getting the playoff, because let's be honest, UCF doesn't have a shot, despite I think they should have a spot or a shot to gain a spot. West Virginia probably has the best chance out of that 4-team group, and I would say if they went out, they should probably be in the playoff if Notre Dame loses and Michigan loses. That's it. You know, that's all I'm going to really say about that, because I have a lot of faith in West Virginia right now. Selling it out there, I didn't have as much faith as I do now a month ago. They're playing really good football as of late. Number 6, Georgia. Impressive win against Auburn, kind of. I mean, I'm not high on Auburn, a 6-4 team who struggled early in the season, lost to Tennessee. That looks a little bit better. But even then, you know, they faced a little bit of adversity, being down early, but pulling away also in the second quarter. Georgia looks good, and they look like they could compete with Alabama on both sides of the ball. Offense is starting to get clicking, and defensively, I mean, you're not going to see a front four better than Auburn all season for Georgia unless you play Clemson in the playoff. That's the only scenario where you see a better front four. Auburn's got an elite front four, and even though Alabama's is good, despite they got a front three with a 3-4 scheme, Georgia, if they can control the line of scrimmage against Auburn, they can definitely control the line of scrimmage against Alabama. I was thinking that when I was seeing that game. And then if they're able to score, you know, against Alabama, if their defense plays really good, they could win with 20 points against Alabama. I can't believe I'm saying that, because I was one of the subscribers to a very good offense in Alabama. But honestly, if Tua's a little bit banged up, they can win with 20 points against Alabama. I don't know if they'll score more. They won't score more than 30. And I don't know if they will even get to that 20 mark, but, you know, they have a shot. They definitely do. Number 5, a team who should get a shot, UCF. Mackenzie Milton is electrifying, and I don't know why people have stopped talking about him. They haven't lost, and their win against Pitt looks impressive. And quite honestly, to this point last year, they were ranked, of course, they're ranked higher this year, but they were getting more respect in terms of people trying to get them a push into the top 10, and no one's respecting them when they say they got a weak schedule this year, but they refused to say that last year. I'm going to remind you real quick that UCF didn't beat anyone outside of conference that was in the Power 5 other than Maryland. Pitt is a division winner, and UCF manhandled them. Pitt or UCF would quite easily win the ACC Coastal right now if they were in that division. You know, based on how that division is being played. So, why aren't we giving UCF a little more love? They would probably get a shot to play Clemson, which, quite honestly, with the style of offense that they play, I wouldn't be surprised if UCF beats Clemson. especially because I think Clemson's a little bit overrated. Specifically, that back end is a little bit overrated, and their offense is overrated a bit. They haven't really been tested too much. They were tested against Boston College and didn't put up crazy stats. But give UCF a shot. Like, come on. I'm getting tired of that, too. Number 4, Michigan. Nothing really to say here. They beat Rutgers down after beating Penn State down. I think actually by the same score. But anyway, nothing much to say here with Michigan looking good. Number 3, Notre Dame, not looking as good. Even though they beat Florida State convincingly, at this point, everyone beats Florida State convincingly. That's a top 10 team, and Notre Dame's a top 10 team. But I don't know if they will be able to get through Syracuse and USC. This is just me being skeptical. But they only got 2 more games, and then they can make the playoff. I think, though, with how weak Notre Dame's schedule has been and catching Michigan at the right time, which is the very first game of the season, it's a crime. Well, not a crime to put them in, but I think it's going to be a criminal act to, and sarcastically speaking, of course, or not sarcastic, but you know what I mean. Not literally act, but I think it will be an issue that if Notre Dame's in there and they have to play Clemson or Michigan even, I think they will get throttled. And we could be talking, if it's Notre Dame versus Clemson or Notre Dame versus Michigan, one of the two, we could be talking about a 30, 40-point game. I don't like this Notre Dame team right now. I don't think they're going to be that competitive against the big dogs. They haven't played any of them since the very first week of the season, in which that team switched out Shea Patterson for Dylan McCaffrey and really just they controlled the game outside of the first quarter. They were down 14-0, Michigan was, to Notre Dame at the end of 1. And the game ended up being 24-17 with Michigan a chance to win the game late at Notre Dame. So, and then Ball State happened, Vanderbilt happened, Pitt happened, and Northwestern happened, where they struggled in all those games. And by the way, all but Northwestern were at home. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sold on Notre Dame as a team, but if you're undefeated as Notre Dame, you cannot be left out, and you should be number 3. Number 2, Clemson, and I'm not big on Clemson, but I think they'll be able to walk into the championship if they have Notre Dame. And I think anyone else they would lose to pretty convincingly. I think if they had Michigan, they'd lose to pretty convincingly. And Alabama, they would definitely lose to convincingly. I think Georgia would beat them convincingly. And I think, to be honest, 7 through 10 could all beat Clemson. And UCF, I would give them a serious shot against Clemson. I would give all of the top 10 a serious shot against Clemson. Just like you would give Syracuse a serious shot against Clemson. But, they're winning games convincingly as of late, and that's all you really got to say. Okay, here we go. Clemson 10-0. Number 1, Alabama. Now, Alabama is number 1, and they are the best team in America right now. But they are not the most dominant team of all time. If we look at Alabama this year, they haven't played anyone outside of LSU and unranked Mississippi State. And an unranked Mississippi State team, that's still a quality win. But if you look at how that game was played, and I'm being critical, but again, you got to be critical when you're talking to Alabama in the lights of 95 Nebraska. I don't know what. 93 Nebraska, the Tommy Frazier team, and 2001 Miami, the likes of those guys. If you're going to compare Alabama to those guys, you got to look at how the games are played. Alabama hasn't played anyone. They opened up against Louisville. That's their toughest out of conference. Outside of that, it was Arkansas State, Louisiana Lafayette, and the Citadel this week. So they played no one out of conference. In conference, Texas A&M is probably the best team they played before LSU. Texas A&M is what, a 500 football team? I think they're 6-4, maybe 5-5. I can't remember. They're not good. Texas A&M's average. And by the way, that's the same thing to go with Clemson. It is they allowed so many yards to Kellen Mond when Texas A&M looks like crap. Calamon looks like crap. That was a one-off. And then you watch LSU, and everyone's just going crazy about how Alabama won 29-0 and LSU couldn't move the ball. LSU never moves the ball on Alabama. LSU had no shot in that game, and that's why when it came down to it, I've been saying all preseason, all season, that LSU is going to beat Bama. But when it really came to the week prior, like the week leading up to their bye weeks, I'm like, there's no way I'm picking against Alabama in this game. No way. I thought it was going to be closer. That was because I didn't expect LSU to really give up towards the end. They had a shot to score a couple points, but honestly, they really didn't deserve to. Now, when you look at Mississippi State, oh my gosh, back-to-back shutouts. This team is so good. No. Okay. Their first possession, they scored a touchdown, right? And by the way, this was 24 points we're talking about. Their first possession, they score a touchdown. That shouldn't have happened. Damian Harris fumbled the ball not even before midfield for Alabama. That would have given Mississippi State the ball. At the very most, they could have got a touchdown, but at the very least, they could have just kept the touchdown. Off the board. So the block in the back, that was completely fraudulent and criminal to call. Oh my gosh, that was awful. He didn't even touch him, and they called a block in the back as the guy's crossing the goal line. That's another 7. That is a guaranteed 7. That should have been on the board. That resulted in no points for Mississippi State. So we're looking at something in between 17-7, 17-14, and the demeanor of the game changes for Mississippi State and Alabama, granted. But I don't see Alabama really scoring because after the first 2 possessions, Alabama scored 10 points. Okay, well, if you go ahead and use the same 10 points for Alabama, I don't know. The point is, it should have been more like a 17-7, 17-14 game. Alabama's not that dominant. As good as they are, they have just not played anyone. And they're going to play Georgia. And I think that'll be their biggest test of the year. And, man, will we see how good this Alabama team is. If they can win the championship, they got to finish this one out before we can start comparing them to the greats. So quit talking about Alabama right now as a great before they've even really sniffed playing a top 10 team, because LSU, like it or not, is not a top 10 team specifically on offense. Sorry. I think the line between Oman and LSU wide as hell. Teams under consideration. Good segue. Buffalo's right there at 9-1. They're playing good football right now. I'm going to give them a little bit of love. Fresno State just lost. They're 8-2. I'm going to give them a little bit of love also because they only lost by 7 against Boise State on the road on Friday night. I ranked them at 17 last week. They dropped out for me because you just have very little room for error when you're a ranked group of 5 team. Utah State is probably going to drop really far if they lose one of their next 2 games, and same with UCF. UCF's going to drop a ton if they lose one of their next 3 games. Mississippi, well, of course, Cincinnati and UCF is for the conference championship, so 2 to 3 games. Mississippi State at number 3 out, and Mississippi State's not a bad team. They are a good defense. They're a really elite defense, but man, it's kind of like LSU. They don't have an offense. Specifically, it's a one-dimensional offense with the quarterback run, but you look at quarterbacks that have beaten Bama in the past, Nick Fitzgerald just doesn't fit that mold because Nick Fitzgerald isn't even really a good thrower. He's actually pretty bad with the football, if you have to ask me, throwing it downfield as good as he is running it. If you take a look at quarterbacks that have beaten them in the past. Last year was Jarrett Stidham, who, by the way, got it done mostly through the arm. But was able to get a little bit on the ground. Deshaun Watson mostly does it with his arm, but is able to make plays on the ground. How about, who was it? Chad Kelly. Chad Kelly makes majority of his plays through the air, but can also do it on the ground. Before that, because Chad Kelly beat him, Chad Kelly beat him. It was Cardale Jones. Cardale Jones, same thing. He mostly did it through the air, but could also do it on the ground. Then you go to Bo Wallace. He's the exception, not the rule. Bo Wallace was not. He was very inconsistent throughout years. But for the most part, Bo Wallace was not good with the football. But that defense for Ole Miss was rather elite and illegal. Cheated to get that, but anyway. And that offense didn't score a whole lot of points against Alabama either. So it was really the defense that won. That Vinquez Golson with the pick in the back of the end zone in 2014. 2013. Nick Marshall. Okay, well, let's look at individual games too. Bo Wallace went crazy through the air as well, or at least better than he's ever been against Alabama. And we're going to stop probably at, Mainzel. But looking at, back to what I was saying about Nick Marshall, he also had a very good game through the air. It took a kick six to win that ball game, and there was only 21 points allowed for Auburn's offense. And finally, you get to Johnny Manziel, who could do it. Oh, wait, by the way, I also forgot about Trevor Knight, who did most of it through the air but could also run. And Johnny Manziel. He was one of the luckiest passers I've ever seen, but nonetheless, he could do it through the air. But he also did it on the ground. These quarterbacks who beat Alabama aren't the ones who just run the ball up the middle like Nick Fitzgerald does. The quarterbacks that beat Alabama are these guys who can scramble, extend plays, and wave receivers around to get open. That's who beats Alabama at quarterback. I'm a secret genius. I'm just kidding. All right, let's move on. Arizona State, I think a quality win right there, and I think a big win against Colorado. I think they have a big win against. No, wait, it was Utah who plays Colorado. They've already played Colorado and lost. Can't remember who Arizona State has this week. Either way, though, a couple wins, Arizona State will be up there, and winning the South, Arizona State will definitely be ranked. UAB. I dropped them because they only won in overtime against Southern Miss. Looked bad, even though they had Johnson in the game rather than Erdely. But I think Erdely is going to be out for a little while, so I'm going to go ahead and keep UAB down there at 9-1. And Duke, 7-3 Duke. They haven't really beat anyone. But Duke has a chance against Clemson to really make a statement, and they are definitely going to be ranked in the top 20 if they beat Clemson. That's all for today. I'm sorry about the long break that I had, and I'm sorry about the long rants that I had late. Thank you guys for tuning in. Really appreciate it. I'll see you later.